So as promised, here is the kind of more in-depth video around these custom code blocks. And I've actually re-recorded this because I realised that actually most people had questions around the code itself and not necessarily like the blocks and sort of the ideas behind them. So I really wanted to actually show you the ChatGPT conversation, but where I've added so much to it, it's just not loading for me anymore. But I will go into the code itself and I will show you and talk a little bit about it and how I kind of generated it and everything as well. So the first thing I want to preface is that this is at the moment completely experimental. So I am by no means an expert in how this all works. I'm not an expert in the security around this, in the accessibility around this. I am playing around with these custom code blocks within a personal project so that I can start to iron out some of these issues and explore these issues in an environment where it does not impact anybody. So, don't come for me if these aren't completely perfect. This is very much about getting used to how this functionality works and starting to scope out how this can be beneficial within our client projects as well. So you can see here I've opened the code for this email communication block. And to generate the code, I used ChatGPT. Now, I've spoken a lot about the way I programmed these. So when I did the first block, and I shared that a couple of weeks ago, and it was just down here. Let me scroll right down. This one here, which is writing an email. I mentioned how the feedback was live and got a few questions around what that meant and whether it's like live generating based on the person's sort of input and all of that kind of stuff. So to clarify on that, what I meant by live is that it is adjusting feedback based on what the learner inputs in. Now, this isn't doing it with an AI kind of assistant or chatbot or anything like that. The feedback itself is programmed into the HTML code. So you can see here, that is our model answer. And then if we scroll down, this is all the things that I've asked it to pick up on. So if I had written an example here but missed the specific details about the actual meeting that Eleanor had missed, it would flag up this part of the feedback. And what it does is it searches for what is missing and then builds the feedback based on this. So it's kind of emulating a chatbot, but without actually live kind of scanning what the learner is writing, which does help in terms of that kind of data storing aspect and that security aspect, because it's not storing any information and it's not, there's no AI functionality going on in the background whilst they're doing this. It is based purely on what I have kind of told it to do, essentially. So when I was generating the code for this, I asked the AI generator to essentially take the model answer and look for specific things and provide feedback based on this. And actually, it did call it live feedback, but that's what it's doing. It's picking up on these key words or key details that aren't missing and creating feedback based on that. And I've used this very similar structure throughout a couple of the other blocks as well. So in terms of actually creating these blocks, one of the other questions that I've got is around how I was able to make them responsive. So if I use this one as our example here, and I jump down to tablet view, let's just press down here, you can see that they are responsive. If I go to tablet landscape, you can see it resizes, and on mobile as well. So it resizes really nicely, much better than a storyline block in my opinion or anything else. So that is for me one of the biggest perks of using these blocks over a storyline block. So to do this, when I was generating the code, at the very front of my prompt to ChatGPT, I asked it to ensure that the activity it was creating was responsive, but also applicable for a RISE custom code block. And it was able to pick that up and ensure that these blocks were suitable for RISE specifically. So my advice would be always front end it with that, because then it's going to adjust everything else afterwards to ensure that it works for Rise. And sometimes you have to make a couple of tweaks. So if I scroll down to this activity here with the markers, I had to tweak this a lot because it was really, really struggling with these markers and fitting them on mobile. I reformatted this about 5 or 6 times because it keeps sort of shooting the markers off the side of the screen, and it was really struggling with that. So there is instances where you may have to go back in and change it, or ask it to change some of the sort of formatting or the functionality. But for the most part, for very simple blocks like these reflective style activities, it resizes them really well if you put that prompt at the front. The next thing I kind of want to flag is editing your code. So once I'd generated kind of a first version, I then put it into Rise itself so I could get that preview of what it looks like. And a few times there's always a little tweak that I want to make. So perhaps this submit button first didn't come out as pink. It came out as white. If I wanted to make that change, I could either go into the code itself. So here you can see we've got all of our code, and I could just find where the button is, the styling for the button. So here we go, submit button, and I could literally just change the hex code in here. So for really simple changes, I would recommend doing this route. So if you're just changing maybe a little bit of the text, or you just want to change the color of a button or the color of the background. So you can see here, this is our error text if they don't type anything. If I just wanted to change this and say, don't forget to put your ideas in, I could just delete that text and retype it. You wouldn't have to put that back into any kind of AI generator at all. And again, this is what I like about this, because you don't have to be an expert in HTML code to be able to recognize this structure. Once you're familiar with it and you can pinpoint the bit that it's talking about, you can very, very quickly make changes. Whereas if you're using a storyline block, you'd have to go back into storyline, make the change, republish to review, and then reintegrate it back in. Whereas this is so much quicker, and obviously it gives you a live preview. So if I change the color of this button and then obviously clicked out of the settings, that change would be instant. So it's very quick in that aspect. If I wanted to do something slightly bigger, so here you can see this button has almost like a grow animation on it. If I wanted to change this to say be a pulse or a hover or a float animation, then I would have to probably go back into my generator. And the key thing here is to make sure that your AI generator, whatever you're using, doesn't change anything else aside from the one thing you want it to change. So when I was first playing around with this, particularly with this activity here, I was having so many issues where I was wanting it to say, just change the icon here, but leave everything else alone. But every time I went back to the generator and said, can you just change the visited icon to be a check, it would then change everything. It would come back and this would be a completely different format. These icons were somewhere else, and it was really frustrating. So what I actually learned from sort of experimenting was the best thing to do in that instance is to copy the existing code. So it's really easy to do. You just go back to your pencil icon, press this button here that says copy, and put that into your generator and say, keep this code exactly the same, and then list what it is you want it to change. And that for me has worked so far, in terms of it will keep literally everything else the same with the code, but it will just pinpoint the one thing you want to change. And that has allowed it to remain fairly stable for me and actually make any bigger changes very quick. So with this activity, when I wanted to just change the icon, I used that route, and eventually it kept these buttons in the same place. So that's another kind of key tip if you are going to be exploring the custom code as well. So that's kind of the first part of this, and my thoughts around how it's best to kind of start mocking these up. The next thing I would pinpoint potentially is around imagery. So as you can notice with these blocks, they don't really include any images. They're very text-based. Now, I have experimented with adding in imagery, but if you're then putting that code into Rise, you have to have that image stored somewhere, either on a server within a media library, and then you have to link to the image so that the code knows where to find the image, essentially. And that can be quite tricky if you don't know what you're doing. And it is a bit temperamental. If I just put into ChatGPT, create me an email activity and have a couple of pictures on the side of people typing on their laptop, it would try and source images from, say, like Unsplash or Pexels or whatever, or from general kind of the web. But again, obviously you run into problems that you don't know where those images have come from, but also you then have to be able to link out to those images, because once you take it out the AI generator and put it into Rise, it doesn't know where those images have come from. So it doesn't almost like download them, if that makes sense. So that makes things a little bit more complicated. You need to have a place where you have stored that imagery and be able to link out to it within the code to get that to work. So that's why I've kind of kept these fairly simple for now, just to make things easier for myself. So in terms of the look and feel, sort of keeping on with that customization aspect, you'll notice that all my blocks have the same look and feel. And this is partly caused why my ChatGPT conversation is so massive, because I created all of these blocks on the same conversation. So when I created this first block down here, what I did was provide a reference image, which was the screenshot from the original storyline file. And then I also provided it with specifics. So I gave it the hex code for this beige colour and for the pink. I gave it the font I wanted and a brief kind of description as to how I wanted it to look, that I wanted it to mimic the reference photo, not necessarily exactly, but in style, that I wanted it to look like a mock email and use the beige for the background and the pink for the button. And it managed to translate it very well, almost first try. I don't think I had to regenerate this really, apart from just adding a few little extras like the animations on the buttons. But the actual look and feel, it generated it incredibly well first time. So using that reference image really helps. So when you're kind of creating these, if you've got a very specific theming or branding for your Rise build, then create a very mini mood board with some image references to give to your generator so that it can follow something. And it should mock it up fairly close to what you're kind of expecting. And then again, like I've said, you can then regenerate it or tweak things as you go based on what you want the output to be. So once I'd done that for the one block and I was happy with how it looked, when I created all of these, I just asked it to maintain that same look and feel. So maintain that font, maintain the colouring, maintain the style, this kind of thick border with these thinner borders on the inside. And it has managed it really well for all of these blocks. So these were all created in the same conversation and they all maintain almost identical styling. So that again is a tip from me, is use that same thread, because it will allow you to create that consistency, because obviously AI is unpredictable. It, as I mentioned with that kind of editing and that version control, it can go off on a bit of its own little tangent really if you regenerate it. So the more you can kind of create that consistency, the better, and the quicker it will become for you to create these blocks. So that is it in a nutshell. And as I kind of said, I'm no expert in this. I'm still learning a lot about it. I'm not a coder at all. So I do completely understand the concerns that people have around security. Accessibility is a massive one. I know that these activities are keyboard accessible, but I've heard that lots of people have run into issues with screen readers, and people have been sharing some really fantastic alternatives. But for me, there is not much point really incorporating these into a lot of my client builds if they're just completely not accessible. I mean, I do get the instances where a client says, I don't care about accessibility, which unfortunately does happen quite often. But for the most part, I want to make my builds as accessible as possible. Otherwise, what's the point? You're alienating a demographic of learners there. So Yeah, it's a very tricky balance with these at the moment in terms of being able to input them and have fun with this and be creative, but also ensure that they are accessible or can be used by people. And with certain activities or with certain blocks, people have been able to create accessible workarounds, such as adding in an accordion block. So, for example, if they've done like flashcards, um, or adding in audio transcripts and things like that, which is great. For me, where it becomes tricky is with these reflection blocks, because I went down the route of doing a lot of user input blocks because Rise is categorically lacking in this. And recreating this accessibly would be very hard because there isn't really an accessible alternative. They could just think about their ideas, um, and that would probably be the workaround. But yeah, it's tricky. So as I said, there's still a long way to go with this. There's still a lot of testing that needs to be done. I need to do some testing with screen readers. I need to kind of do further exploration in terms of the security around this and how that can impact things as well. But at the moment, we're just playing with it. We're just seeing what can be created and whether sort of how well these do integrate with Rise in terms of the responsiveness, the design, all of that stuff as well. So I won't go through all of these blocks, but I will say that obviously there's quite a lot in what this is, like a 10-minute micro learning. So I probably wouldn't usually put this much custom code in there. But again, as I've said, it's all for playing and exploration at the moment. But I've tried to incorporate blocks where I feel Rise doesn't have the functionality, or I don't particularly think Rise's functionality works very well. So the reason I've done this, so obviously we have a labeled graphic function within Rise, but I find the labeled graphics do not translate down devices well at all. It shrinks the image and it just looks messy, and it makes the markers really tiny, and I don't know why. So that's why I kind of went down the route of a custom code block for that particular exercise. So you can see this one maintains that text size really nicely, so it's not shrinking. Obviously, as well, if I was doing a labeled graphic, this text would have to be part of a flat image, which again would impact accessibility. So I've tried to only use custom code where I feel like Rise is really lacking in that existing functionality. For example, this one is almost like a reverse hotspot. So this is supposed to be in this weird formatting. It's for the learner to sort of pick out where there's potential issues or problems with this particular email example. And if we carry on scrolling down, another way I have used it is for multiple questions as well within one block. I'll come to that in a minute. I just want to talk about this particular activity too. This is a really nice one. So they have to type in an example email that they might send, and they have to do it across multiple different tones of voice, and then they can compare what they have written as well, and they can hide this again if they need to and reset the activity. And this is what I mean when I say creating functionality that Rise just cannot do. And again, yes, you could create this with Storyline, that would work, but I still find a storyline block really disrupts the flow of the learning experience, because if you're on anything but a desktop, and I mean sometimes tablet, if you're on a mobile device, it will pop that storyline block out in almost like a separate pop-up, and it just feels very disjointed. So I do try and avoid using storyline blocks as much as possible, to be honest, because I just really, I don't know, I just don't think they sort of contribute to a very good learning experience if you were on anything but a desktop. So again, this is a nice alternative, but in terms of recreating accessibility wise, this is another example of an activity that would be really tricky to recreate accessibility wise. The alternative would be they would pop open an email window within their software, but again, that's not giving them the same learning experience, so that's not fair. So it's really tricky. It's really tricky. But anyway, so here's what I was talking about. So everybody knows with Rise, if you want to add more than one multiple choice, multiple response question in, then you have to use like multiple blocks, and it means the learner has to scroll for so long, and it's just, it's very annoying. So this is almost like a bit of a branching scenario. It would be if I programmed it all in properly, but this is just a personal project. So, but they build this email, they choose their options, and then they can view their email so far to see how it is coming together. So they start to build this kind of response to this colleague, and they can view the final email at the end. And then at the end, they've got another reflective activity where they have to input their thoughts, and they can view a best practice example as well. So obviously, again, I could recreate that in Storyline, or I could use multiple rise blocks. But if I'd used multiple choice blocks, like I said, the learner would just be scrolling for ages. And again, that doesn't make a very good experience, in my opinion, anyway. So it's really important that these have a purpose, they have value, and we're not just kind of adding all this in just for, the sake of it. Again, this is another example of like a reverse hotspot. So they have to find where the mistakes are within this email and click on them. They are given a little bit of a hint because you can see my mouse changes to a hand. This one would, if I can iron out and make sure that it can sort of merge well with screen readers. This one is accessible because it is keyboard accessible. So they can just tab down and click on the different sections. It's just making sure the screen reader would be able to read it out. So that is pretty much it. I've been through this activity already, so I won't go through that again in more depth. And they end with a reflective block, which allows them to save. Now, to be honest, a lot of this we should have in Rise already. Reflective blocks we should have. That should be a thing. We shouldn't need to use code for that. We shouldn't need to use add-ons or Mighty or whatever. Like, it's so simple. We should have that. But at the moment, code is a nice filler for adding these type of activities in without having to use Storyline. Obviously, the benefit with Storyline is that it is accessible. So for now, if I'm creating an e-learning that needs to be accessible, which it should always be that way, I would have to use Storyline for this. So I'm really hoping that we can figure out how to make these accessible, because then it will just open up a world of possibilities for them. And of course, security as well, ensuring that these are safe and not impacting any user data or anything like that as well. So particularly, obviously, if you're working with quite sensitive subject matter, we don't want to be going into any data protection issues or anything like that. But yeah, so that's kind of what I've done with it so far. I hope you found that kind of useful in terms of just talking about generating the code itself. Apologies that I couldn't show you the actual ChatGPT conversation. But hopefully that's given you a good idea as to how you can kind of get started with this and just have a play around. And do let me know if you have had a go at this and you've managed to get it to be accessible. How have you done it, or what workarounds have you been using to ensure that everybody kind of can access the same learning experience? So do discuss, and I'll keep you updated as to what I kind of come up with and find as well.